So fun but trivial examples, these sort of these three things really sort of coalesce across sort of three fundamental traps that are relevant to any of the products that we'll all be building. And that's, so firstly, well, I'll start in the middle. A British economist in the 1970s, Goodhart. So what he's famous for is declaring that when metrics become targets, you optimize for the wrong thing, right? So when getting a high score on the GPQA benchmark or the MMLU benchmark, when that metric becomes a target, that's bad. It's not giving us an actual indication of the real world performance of the model. And we start to see this gap, a gap appearing between amazing benchmark scores and then real world performance that you'll see every day when your users are using either your product or you yourself are using the chatbots. Circularity, so that's the evaluation signals feeding back in. So the data, not just the questions, but the answers feeding back in. And then also the overfitting issue and bias, where you have, like with the farmer's dilemma, many of the models, particularly, so not the very strongest, but just 3 or 4 months ago, the latest models were still getting this wrong. And a lot of the models that run at the edge, so when heavily quantized in order to run on a local machine, they still get that wrong. But what the result is, you get not just high benchmark scores, but a false confidence in the answers. You cannot trust those numbers that you're being given. So how do you work around that? How do you beat that? Well, I'll come on to that in a second. And then finally, loss of variety. So only testing one particular way. I think many of you will know this already, maybe better than me. But testing not just on standard benchmarks, but incorporating your own business data and building evaluations, both visual and textual, in order to cover different angles of how that system is going to perform. So the vision language model, having never seen a manual gear stick with a label on it, as an example of that. So what does this lead to? Well, 3 traps, and then leading into 5 eval challenges. So we've got to get beyond the metrics. So yes, it's interesting, but it actually masks the real world performance. You've got to get into specific tests for your domain, and I'll talk about how you can tackle that in a moment. Challenge 2, so System-Eval Coupling. I love doing things like test-driven development, and that's great, but it's a real issue where your tests are, you think, okay, if it passes all the tests in my continuous integration, continuous deployment system, if it's all ticks across the Jenkins dashboard for my pipeline, that's good, right? The product's great. Well, actually, the real challenge is that the engineers, the teams, the squads building the system will obviously target and want to beat that test and get ticks across the board. And you end up with a system that is coupled to the test so tightly, you may miss those edge cases. And actually the tests can then end up influencing the system design. So you just end up building to pass the tests. But actually what I'm trying to say is the testing and the evaluation of these things, it's its own internal product itself. It needs to evolve and grow and change. I've kind of spoiler alert on number 4 there, in terms of evolving and changing the frameworks as the AI's capabilities advancing. So swapping out a new model or using a fine-tuned model that you've tuned yourself, understanding the difference between those different cases and staying within a configuration managed environment, but improving and changing those evaluations as the technologies improve. I'm going to jump back to number 3. So just be aware. So maybe you are as well, but it was news to me sort of in the last 6 months as starting this business and going deep on this topic, that just how much sort of gaming and training for the test there is going on. And so looking deeper at the MMLU benchmark, for example, it's a few thousand questions. About between 5 and 10% of those questions are actually wrong. If you actually go in to look at the data set, read the question, look at the answers, it was quite eye-opening for me to learn that. So just being aware of the test gaming that is going on in terms of the models that are out there. And then finally, domain specificity. It's hard to say. But the generic tests, they just miss the edge cases. So they're literally the very first step is to start with those. But immediately we have to look at industry specific, domain specific testing, building your own benchmarks, and then trying to discover and surface what those edge cases might be. And for me in aviation, the LLM's not flying the plane, okay? So it's all right. We're not proposing doing any of that. But even for things like market analysis, understanding or predicting perhaps the share prices of airlines, understanding the real world, how things happen in the real world in terms of flights and times and slots and commercial implications and just how business works in my industry. So domain specificity and covering those edge cases is vital for the credibility of certainly the things I've been working on.